Yep, this is a performance-based regulation working group meeting on resilience metrics. This meeting is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Energy, and we thank them for their ongoing support. At this time, I'd like to introduce Commissioner Charlotte Mitchell to moderate our panel. Commissioner Mitchell.
Well, thank you, Carrie, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here with us on a Friday afternoon, maybe morning, where some of you all are. My name is Charlotte Mitchell. I'm presently serving as the chair of the North Carolina Utilities Commission. Appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all today and to hear from these panelists. As you all know, over the past several years, there's been an increased focus on resilience, likely will continue to increase in the coming years. Utilities have been able to measure and make progress towards industry-wide metrics for reliability, but only recently has focus really narrowed down on resilience. And for the first time, the Task Force on Resilience Framework Methods and Metrics for the electricity sector has documented a framework for assessing resilience. Today we have with us, we're very fortunate to have with us, the three contributors to the report to provide us with a comprehensive look sort of at the current state of metrics associated with resilience so that we can all gain a better understanding of what those metrics are and give some thought to how we might develop appropriate metrics for our various jurisdictions, states and jurisdictions. And this conversation today is also intended to inform future conversation of this group on the implementation of PIMS in the context of resilience. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists, our speakers today, and then turn it over to them so that we can get rolling here. First, we have with us Joe Etto. Joe is a staff scientist at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, where he's a senior advisor for the Electricity Markets and Policy Department and the Energy Storage and Demand Resources Division. He conducts research for the Department of Energy on resilience planning, reliability metrics and trends, and on the economic value of reliability to electricity customers. Today, Joe will discuss the differences between reliability and resilience, review resilience and economic cost, and share a few insights about stakeholder engagement on these topics. Also with us today, we have Dr. Bobby Jeffers, who has contributed to Sandia's Energy Resilience Research Program since 2013. He leverages a variety of modeling tools to better understand the human, natural, and engineered systems. He has a background in environmental science, the energy water nexus, supply chain economics, and renewable power integration. He currently works across multiple federal agencies on energy resilience issues. Today, Dr. Jeffers will discuss social and national security disruption costs, note the limitations of setting baselines, and also he'll discuss incorporating uncertainties into our resilience frameworks. All right, and finally, we have Bill Chu. Bill is the Managing Director of Transmission and Distribution System and Asset Strategies at SoCal Edison, with responsibility for the integrated system planning and asset management strategies to address a variety of transformational opportunities for the electric grid. He's an accomplished engineer and has a long history of supporting grid resilience, including multi-year wildfire mitigation programs. He currently is a liaison between the IEEE Industry Technical Leadership Support Committee and the FERC. Today, he will pick up the pieces in this conversation and provide reflections on bringing the work of the task force back to SCE and sort of the practical side of implementing resilience metrics. All right, with that, we are going to hear first from Joe, so I will turn it over to you.
Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Very good. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great opportunity to talk with you about the work that we do at the lab. I've been asked to kick this session off by doing some level setting and talking about the relationships and differences between reliability and resilience. I'll talk about features, metrics, actions, decision-making, and some implications for grid resilience metrics. Next slide, please. This is a table I present a lot, trying to compare features of reliability and resilience. I think starting with the basic idea of the continuity of service, reliability and resilience exist on a continuum. The differences have to do with the frequency, duration, and scope of the events. When we talk about reliability events, we're talking typically about routine, expected, not planned, normally localized, short duration interruptions of electric service. With resilience, we're talking about infrequent, widespread, many folks affected, many hours of the disruption. Often as a result of the significant size of these effects, there's also corollary effects that are very important to take into account. One way that I like to distinguish between the two is larger events and reliability will typically make it into the local headlines. Resilience events are always national headline worthy. They're also very event-based. We have lots of cause codes for reliability, but with resilience, there's usually one cause code. It's a severe weather event, a hurricane, an earthquake, wildfire, etc. The implication here for metrics is that the event itself defines the kinds of metrics that may be of most relevant to take into consideration. So when doing discussions around resilience plans, it's very important to think about the events that you want to be resilient against and formulate the metrics around those specific features. Reliability has lots of well-established metrics, SAIDI, safety, MAFI. There's even provisions for major events, bad hair days, but they really include non-electricity impacts. That said, there are reliability metrics that exist that speak to some of these resilience issues, some things like CLID, customers experiencing long interruption durations, or SEMI, customers experiencing multiple interruptions. With resilience, because of the singular nature of the events that you're talking about, there's lots of very easy to understand, but they're not standardized, kinds of metrics that you can develop. At the end of this talk, I'll show some examples from a Sandia Oregon grid modernization report that categorizes. There's no shortage of metrics. The question here is, what do you want to use the metrics for, and therefore which metrics are important? A very important dimension of a lot of the resilience metrics is that it's going to speak to non-electricity impacts. Because of these corollary impacts from these events, things like the cost of firms, health and safety, things that Bobby will talk about in terms of community and national security type of metrics will become very relevant in this regard. Now, in terms of what you do about these things, the actions for reliability applying are very straightforward. Plan, prepare, manage, endure, recover, restore. Try to learn from what happened and try to do better the next time. Now, resilience planning is very, very similar in terms of the same steps that are involved, but because these events are larger in scope and often in cost in terms of what you want to do about them, decision-making is much more complicated. And I think that's really where the principal differences, as far as I'm concerned, exist, and that's where the implications for reliability metrics and performance-based rate making come into play. Let's go to the next slide. When we talk about decision-making and reliability, it's usually a very closed system of the utility and its regulator within the standard setting of a rate case in terms of approving distribution expenses to improve reliability of a power system and reviewing reliability performance. When it comes to resilience, because these are, again, headline events, the same central parties, of course, are involved, the utility and its regulator, but they're often convening at the direction of an external order, a legislative direction, a governor's order, typically after a large, very severe weather event that has had a very disruptive effect on the economy. And because the effects are so widespread, what really complicates decision-making is that there are many parallel processes going on. There are other infrastructures and institutions that are affected that have both standing in the decision-making that the utility and regulator are going to reach, as well as they have their independent processes dealing with their aspects of their scopes of responsibility with respect to these same events. And so there's a huge coordination challenge, many more players at the table. And so I would say this is also another complication for reliability metrics, and in particular for performance-based rate making, which is you want to separate the actions for which the utility can have responsibility from a management perspective, from those that others have to have responsibilities for. And I think, Bill will talk something about community planning. Community planning is essential in these resilience activities and needs to be done in coordination with utility planning, yet as a separate activity unto itself with different sets of factors that affect decision making. So if it wasn't hard enough to have more parties at the table, the factors that affect decision making are also much more complicated. With reliability, we have actuarial records. We know how often squirrels get electrocuted, how often cars drive into poles. With resilience events, we don't have that actuarial basis, at least not well established yet. And as a result, and because the consequences are so large, you have to take into account people's perceptions of risk and their sense of exposure, and in fact deal with the fact that some of these risks are quite uninsurable. And this really is the conundrum, because a lot of the decision making around resilience is about buying insurance. And the question is, how much insurance do we want to buy, and who's going to pay for it? These are the issues that make this decision making complicated, because there's not a clear fact basis in terms of the frequency, duration, and extent of these events. Similarly, with reliability, you have these well-tested approaches and well-understood means of improving reliability. With resilience, you often have very limited opportunities to test these things in the field. You are sort of taking a gamble. You've done what you need to do to design to a design standard. And because it's a lot of money, there's a lot riding on whether you've done the right thing. With reliability planning, it's understood to be a cost of doing business. You're going to have to spend money on reliability. The question is how much. With resilience, because the amounts are so large in many cases, it just puts a lot more eyes on the table, and eyes on the decision, and concerns about the rate impacts, quite frankly, that are going to result. For this reason, and because of the intangibles, the unknowables that are involved, I feel that in resilient decision making, political leadership is critical, because there are going to be a lot of there won't be complete information. There will be different views of risk and cost and who's going to be bearing them, and that's where political decision making, I think, is essential in terms of moving forward. Now, on this last slide, next slide. One more slide, please. There's no shortage of metrics. This is from some work that the national laboratories did, in this case, Sandia and Argonne. So there's plenty of metrics that are out there. And I think the challenge to you all is to think about what metrics are important for the decisions that you want to make, the decisions that you want the utilities to make, and the consequences that you want them to be thinking about as they make those decisions. And that really, I think, does drive the discussion about what metrics are relevant for these kinds of discussions. So with that, let me conclude and yield the floor to Bobby, and I will be here for the discussion at the end of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe. Charlotte, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you, and I was just gonna make the transition for you, but you're ahead of me. So go ahead, Bobby.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Take it over.
So thanks, Joe. I think those that sets this discussion up rather well. So I'm Bobby Jeffers from Sandia National Laboratories. Next slide, please. And today I'm going to extend the discussion into the realm of consequence and define what we're talking about when we say performance versus consequence, and also mention some of the attribute-based metrics that you may have heard of or may have been presented to you in the realm of resilience in the past. I do most of my work at Sandia National Laboratories for the Department of Energy. I work quite a bit with Joe, and we also contributed to the IEEE report that Bill will be presenting today. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about what constitutes a metric when we're thinking about resilience metrics. Joe presented a host of resilience metrics on that slide there. And again, he's right. There's no shortage of a menu when you're talking about metrics. But I like to put a little bit of a lens on this. And this comes from a series of really of reports and work, most of it out of the DOE, but also the National Academy's report in 2017 calling for an improved understanding of both customer and societal value associated with increased resilience, and also a review to operationalize metrics for resilience. And so we've really taken that to heart with the work under GMLC 1.1 Foundational Metrics funded by the Department of Energy, as well as under the banner of the National North American Energy Resilience Model that culminated in a 2020 resilience metrics report. So really, what are we talking about when we say attribute-based versus performance-based? So an attribute-based metric in general, and resilience metric in particular, really tells you what's making a system more or less resilient. These are things that you can count right now. You can go out and count them on your system on a normal day. These are things like how many backup spare transformers does the utility have? How well trained are their line crews? What types of investments have they been making on the grid over the past 5 years that are going to contribute to resilience? Do critical loads have at least one level of redundancy? That type of thing, right? So they're often grouped into these types of categories: robustness, adaptivity, recoverability, redundancy. And they're often populated via surveys or checklists. So you can go out there and apply a checklist-based method or survey the customers and get a pretty good idea as to the attributes of the system and how you're tracking versus other states, or how utilities are tracking against each other, that type of thing. But what attribute-based metrics might not do is tell you actually how the system performed during outages, right? And so that's what you need a performance-based metric to do. A performance-based metric tells you how resilient is the system, or how resilient was the system to a previous event. And so these are things you can only measure during the disruption, or go back and use data from the disruption in a post hoc way, right? So you often use data from the event directly, or you may use the model of an event if you're doing a forecast or a planning mode, for example. And because we have so few events, right, that speak to our resilience of our system, because they're so naturally rare, this can be difficult. This can be difficult to populate a performance-based resilience metric, especially in a forward-looking manner where events may be changing in frequency or magnitude. And also there's just so much inherent uncertainty in these systems, right? But it's really useful. This is the other side of the coin, right? And they're difficult, but they're very, very useful because we have performance-based metrics in other dimensions. The greenhouse gas emissions is a performance-based metric for sustainability. The net present value of the operations of our grid and the cost of service for the utility, those are performance-based metrics for affordability and efficiency. So how are we going to get a performance-based metric for resilience is really our question that we've been trying to tackle over the past few years, and that we'll speak to during the rest of this presentation. Some commonly mistaken terms are that only performance-based metrics are forward-looking and only attribute-based metrics are historic-looking or in the present. And that's not true. Either approach can be either retrospective or forward-looking. You can apply attribute-based metrics in a projection just as easily as you can apply performance-based metrics. Some other misconceptions are that only performance-based metrics can be focused on the consequence, things like economic consequences and social consequences. That's not true. You can apply attribute-based metrics, focus on economics as well, just as well as you can performance-based metrics. And there's alternative schools of thought in terms of should we be applying resilience metrics in a threat-informed way? So resilient to hurricanes is different than resilient to earthquakes, or should we really just be applying this in a threat-agnostic manner? I'm in the threat-informed camp because I think the things that you're going to do to be resilient to a hurricane are different than the things you're going to do to be resilient to an earthquake or a cyber attack. But I do acknowledge that there are some really powerful threat-agnostic tools and methods out there. Next slide, please. So this really starts to hit it home when Joe said that resilience is a continuum with reliability, right? This is just raw data from one of our partner utilities that's been scrubbed. And this is customer minutes interrupted. So the number of customers out multiplied by the time that they were out. And this is for a period of 3 years, I believe. I've cut off the tail. The tail goes very far off, probably about 20 monitors to your right there. But what I really want to hit home is that if you just focus on SAIDI, SAIFI, customer minutes interrupted, these types of power performance focused metrics, what you're missing is that the consequences of those long duration or more widespread outages increase nonlinearly with the longer and the more widespread outages. And so if you're saying that I care twice as much about a 10-hour outage as a 5-hour outage, you're missing that the 10-hour outage may be 10 times more consequential instead of twice as consequential as the 5-hour outage. Next slide, please. So we've done some work on that third report that I mentioned, the NARM metrics report, really gets into different dimensions of consequence and what metrics are out there today to be able to quantify how our society, how our economy, our national security system is performing during grid outages. I've personally done a lot of work on the social burden metric, which quantifies the time and the money spent by customers to achieve a basic level of human needs. And we've got a framework that's based in social science that allows us to both apply survey-based methods, data-based methods, and models all together to be able to calculate and validate that metric. It's still early days on that metric. I think more validation needs to be done, but be happy to talk to anyone on this panel today and, about what we're doing to calculate that metric. On the economic side, Joe and his team have been doing a ton of great work on value of lost load for more long duration events, and I'm sure he'd be glad to go into more detail about that. But that's giving us the ability to look at what are the economic losses during a more long duration outage as opposed to a shorter duration outage that the current version of the ICE calculator is able to give you. And then we're also doing some work with LBNL and others. Sandia leads a project called Energy Resilience for Mission Assurance from DOE that allows us to really look at how missions perform for the Department of Defense during extended outages. And this is really going to give us the ability to translate an energy focus metric to a mission focus metric so that we can have that conversation between the Department of Defense and our utilities about what's the value of resilience to our national security. So all of these metrics are still relatively nascent. I would say there's a good amount of work to be done. So what can we really do today? We've been doing some work with Synapse Energy Economics to think about what's really the next step to get us closer with what we can do today to these ideal metrics that I talk about above. And one thing that we can think about, and this is really just us throwing it out there for comment, is some utilities and some states are reporting major event day, SAIDI, SAIFI, KAIDI, KAIFI, separately from their regular reliability focused reporting. And that's all we're really talking about right now, just reporting, no performance incentives yet, right? And then second, this is where it's really an extension. Work with the state and local emergency management officials and perhaps other stakeholders to develop a tiered list of critical life-sustaining infrastructure. So that really separates it out from the societal to the economic. You can also work with other stakeholders to develop lists, tiered lists of economically important infrastructure, but really I'm focusing on the societal piece here. And it's really up to you, right? It's up to you to decide with your state legislature, with your governor's offices, what you have the jurisdiction, what you have the authority to regulate on. Is it societal metrics? Is it economic metrics? Is it national security metrics, or none of the above? Really, within societal metrics, what I would say is if you're going to develop these tiered lists, make sure you think about including both front door infrastructure and back door infrastructure. Meaning the customers may come to you and say, hey, this is what I need to be online in a black sky day. And then an agency like FEMA or the State Emergency Management Office might say, here's what we need to keep online during a black sky day. And those lists are going to be usually different because they come from different points of view. So you need to work with both of these sets of stakeholders to really develop this list of both front door and back door infrastructure that's going to provide services during that black sky day. And then you can really report the major event day only CAIDI and CAIFI for each tier of that list or each type of infrastructure. And it'll just give you a better picture of what's performing well, what types of societal providing infrastructures are performing well and getting good service during the outage. And then you can optionally discuss maybe things like, instead of average, which CAIDI and CAIFI are, discussing things like a value at risk approach. So what's the duration for which maybe 95% of your grocery stores have less than that for major event days? Is it 10 hours? Is it 3 hours? So, with that, I'm gonna really leave that for discussion. And next slide, we'll talk about one other piece of this puzzle, which is the equity discussion. So if you're thinking about, let's go to the next slide, please. So if you're thinking about equity within all of this, I hear a lot of metrics that are more blue sky metrics, things like energy burden, exposure to environmental hazards, equitable access to clean energy solutions. I just want to challenge us to think that resilience is also a dimension of equity. And then therefore the ability for people to have equitable services provided to them via the power system serving critical infrastructure during an outage is something we should also be thinking about in equity. And so the consequence-based approaches that we just present here are one way to be able to do that. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over, and thank you guys so much for listening to my presentation today. This is my email address. You can contact me.